This is ATV World. Stay with us as we take a retrospective look at the news and events that shaped our world on 2001, War and Fear.
Hello and welcome to our special program covering the events that shaped the year. A series of terrorist attacks devastated the United States and shook the world in September, dominating headlines for the rest of the year. More than 3,000 people died when hijacked planes slammed into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. It was the first direct attack on the American mainland in more than a century and a complete shock for millions who had felt safe within the borders of the world's only superpower. Nothing could have prepared the American people for the horrifying events of September 11th. An American Airlines plane carrying 81 passengers and 11 crew members slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Manhattan shortly before 9 a.m. New York time, just as thousands of people were arriving for work. The impact opened a huge hole near the top of the 110-story block, setting off a fire that soon consumed the upper section. Just 15 minutes later, as live footage of the crash was being broadcast to viewers worldwide, a United Airlines passenger jet with 64 people on board plowed into the South Tower, causing a massive explosion. The planes had been hijacked at the start of their journeys, which meant they were fully loaded with fuel, part of a plan to cause the maximum possible explosion. Half an hour after the second crash, another American Airlines jet carrying 58 passengers and 6 crew members slammed into the Pentagon in Washington, causing a portion of the 5-sided structure to collapse. It was an attack on the heart of the American military machine, an impregnable fortress that had remained unmolested even during the Cold War. A fourth plane, a United Airlines passenger jet with 45 people on board, crashed near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, amid speculation that a struggle on board caused it to go out of control, away from its target, which could have been the White House or the President's Camp David retreat. While the world watched horrified, there was more devastation to come. The impact of the two planes slamming into the Trade Center caused both towers to collapse one after another, taking down thousands still trapped inside in a shower of debris and thick dust that soon obliterated the Manhattan skyline. The intense fire, fed by thousands of liters of jet fuel on board the two aircraft, weakened the steel supports of the buildings, causing the walls to buckle and the top floors to give way, leading to the collapse of the entire buildings. The entire central Manhattan area had to be evacuated as more than 10,000 rescue workers were deployed. The first wave of emergency personnel rushed into the burning buildings before they collapsed, never to come out again. A third 47-story building close to the Trade Center also collapsed. The attacks were compared to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but the death toll was far higher.
The estimate would be for both of the buildings that although building number two had a chance to clear out, a lot of people probably cleared out of building number two. Building number one had some time to clear out, but there were areas of it that were affected. The best estimate that we can make, relying on the Port Authority and just everyone else that has experience with this, is that there'll be a few thousand people left in each building.
Panic swept across the U.S., plunging the country into a virtual state of war. For the first time in American aviation history, all commercial flights nationwide were grounded. The White House and all government buildings, as well as the Capitol in Washington, were evacuated. U.S. President George W. Bush was rushed to one secret location after another, while warplanes and battleships were deployed in fear of further attacks. The hijackers were unknown men, armed only with box cutters and a steely determination to destroy the citadels of American financial power and military might. They did not leave behind suicide letters or videotaped statements explaining or glorifying their acts. But in just 3 hours, they had managed to hijack 4 airliners and use them to reduce the country's 2 most important cities to war zones of carnage and fear. What they had carried out were calculated acts of terror, managed with a skill not seen before. They had apparently succeeded in penetrating the security systems at several airports and then placed trained pilots on board the doomed flights to complete the job. Evidence would emerge later that they had learned to pilot aircraft at aviation schools in the US. Addressing the nation hours later, the US president said the attacks were acts of war, but hastened to assure the American public that the government was still in control and ready to strike back.
Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve.
One of the first international leaders to condemn the attacks and express condolences was Palestinian President Yasser Arafat, realizing that this was a devastating blow to the Palestinian cause. Mr. Arafat distanced himself from the hijackers and what cause they might have had, fearing that Israel would take advantage of the situation to play international sentiments against the Palestinians by linking them to Islamic terrorists. Mr. Arafat joined other Palestinians in giving blood for the relief effort in New York. As condolences poured in from around the world, the United Nations Secretary General appealed for reason.
There can be no doubt that these attacks are deliberate acts of terrorism, carefully planned and coordinated, and as such, I condemn them utterly. Terrorism must be fought resolutely wherever it appears. In such moments, cool and reasoned judgment are more essential than ever. We do not know yet who is behind these acts or what objective they hope to achieve. What we do know is that no just cause can be advanced by terror.
There were stronger reactions from the European Union and NATO, which for the first time in its 52-year history invoked an article declaring that the atrocities were attacks against all of the alliance's 19 member states.
The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all. The commitment to collective self-defense embodied in the Washington Treaty was first entered into in circumstances very different from those that exist now, but it remains no less valid and no less essential today in a world subject to the scourge of international terrorism.
British Prime Minister Tony Blair said the attacks had been directed against his country as well, given that hundreds of British citizens were killed, and spoke of London's obligation to help bring those responsible to justice.
The world now knows the full evil and capability of international terrorism, which menaces the whole of the democratic world. These terrorists responsible have no sense of humanity, of mercy, or of justice. To commit acts of this nature requires a fanaticism and a wickedness beyond our normal contemplation.
Over the coming days, thousands of disaster workers searched for survivors among the rubble of the Trade Center, now called Ground Zero. Aided by sniffer dogs, bulldozers, and spotlights, New York firefighters and police worked round the clock trying to find signs of life under tons of twisted steel and concrete. The disaster seemed to bring out the best among the people of New York, with firefighters and policemen showing courage and grace during rescue work, while the city's population cheered them on. But it also brought out the worst as the days wore on. On one occasion, New York firefighters clashed with police when Mayor Giuliani decided to cut down the number of personnel on rescue duty. The firefighters said they did not want to rest until the last bodies were brought out of the rubble, amid accusations that the real issue was the loss of lucrative overtime payments when they were pulled off the ground zero shift. And there was more controversy when a wealthy Saudi prince donated $10 million to the relief fund after touring ground zero. While he expressed horror over the carnage and condemned terrorism, his call for the U.S. to be more even-handed when dealing with the Middle East crisis upset Mayor Giuliani, who returned the check. A week after the tragedies, candlelight vigils and memorials were held across New York and Washington, along with the first funerals for the victims. Americans were not alone in their grief, as people across the world also paid their respects to those who died, with memorials, prayer services, and moments of silence. We'll be back after the break with the fallout of the terror attacks, including the war in Afghanistan. Stay with us.
Just what the busy mariner needs. An extra pair of hands. The Rolex Yachtmaster.
Cartoon Christmas is coming to Dragon Center. Your chance to party with the Powerpuff Girls, Johnny Bravo, Dexter, and Dee Dee. Win great prizes on the lucky draw. So you better watch out, you better not cry, and you better call the hotline for details, 2535-2838. Merry Christmas.
In my own personal experience in Texas, I had had a gun pulled on me. So in the scene, I had a suggestion for the director.
You arrested my husband.
Wait!
Mrs. Hendler, Nick, don't move.
They are investigators of CSI, coming on January 7th.
我個仔好乖㗎，一放學就返屋企。返嚟啦？係啊，佢日日都即刻入房做功課，做完先玩一陣電腦。
你知啦，電腦嘅嘢我哋唔熟，都想去識多啲㗎。阿 Sir， 我以為佢返咗屋企就得㗎啦，我都唔知佢用電腦都可以犯罪嘅。
Watch out for computer crime.
Players and their games, highlights and recaps, news and happenings, on the court, behind the scenes. It's the ultimate courtside perspective on NBA action every Sunday evening at 6:30.
我職位高，壓力大，收入高，應酬多啦，血脂高，危險啊，膽固醇升高，甘油三酯升高，漢林牌青脂膠囊每天清一清，血脂不再高，漢林牌青脂膠囊。
The terror attacks on the United States triggered a series of events that would have far-reaching consequences, financial and political, in every corner of the globe. Washington declared war on terrorism and pulled the rest of the world in, saying there was no neutral ground. The campaign against terror began with a war in Afghanistan. Soon after the terror attacks on New York and Washington, the U.S. blamed this man, Osama bin Laden, a Saudi tycoon living in exile in Afghanistan. Washington said bin Laden and his al-Qaeda network had planned and carried out the attacks, and Afghanistan's Taliban rulers were sponsoring terrorism by giving bin Laden and his followers shelter. Bin Laden, himself a creation of American opposition to Soviet rule in Afghanistan, became Washington's public enemy #1 after he was accused of masterminding the U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. Over the next few weeks, Washington began heading down the road to vengeance. The US built up an international coalition to support its efforts to hit back its allies, including governments with shady human rights records. The US also began massing troops and military firepower within striking distance of Afghanistan. But the campaign against terror took off on a controversial note when Washington decided to call the mission Operation Infinite Justice. The name had to be changed quickly to Operation Enduring Freedom to avoid offending Muslim allies who pointed out that only Allah could deliver infinite justice. Repeated warnings were issued to Taliban leaders that they would face the consequences if they did not hand over bin Laden and close all al-Qaeda training camps in the country. The Taliban was defiant at first, given that the militia's supreme ruler, Mullah Muhammad Omar, was a close friend of bin Laden. Taliban officials softened their tone later on, expressing a willingness to surrender the fugitive if they were shown proof of his involvement. But the US refused to negotiate or make public any concrete evidence. It was only towards the end of the year that Washington released a grainy, muffled amateur videotape of what it claimed was bin Laden proving beyond doubt that he was guilty. The tape appeared to show bin Laden discussing the terror attacks in chilling detail and actually naming some of the hijackers. On October 7th, Washington launched a fierce wave of attacks on Afghanistan. The strike was announced by US President George W. Bush, who described it as the first war of the 21st century.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. We are joined in this operation by our staunch friend, Great Britain. Every nation has a choice to make. In this conflict, there is no neutral ground. If any government sponsors the outlaws and killers of innocents, they have become outlaws and murderers themselves. And they will take that lonely path at their own peril.
British Prime Minister Tony Blair also addressed his nation to justify the attacks, despite significant opposition among his people to any war.
No country lightly commits forces to military action and the inevitable risks involved. But we made it clear, following the attacks upon the United States on September the 11th, that we would take part in action once it was clear who was responsible. There is no doubt in my mind, nor in the mind of anyone who has been through all the available evidence, including intelligence material, that these attacks were carried out by the al-Qaeda network masterminded by Osama bin Laden. Equally, it is clear that his network is harbored and supported by the Taliban regime inside Afghanistan.
As in the Gulf War, viewers around the world were treated to the Pentagon's video footage of so-called smart bombs destroying targets with pinpoint precision. The targets were Taliban military installations and al-Qaeda camps, destroyed with some accuracy. But many of the casualties were civilians, as bombs and missiles started going astray, even destroying UN warehouses filled with food and medical supplies. The killing and maiming of innocent Afghan people, including women and children, were described as collateral damage by the Pentagon, which issued no apologies. American planes also dropped food packets for Afghan civilians. But there were some casualties when people began wandering into minefields to pick up the packages, and many mistook brightly colored cluster bomb canisters for food drops. And all the while, there were warnings across the world that the war was triggering a massive refugee crisis, with millions of Afghans fleeing their homes and trying to escape into neighboring countries. The US bombed the Taliban, while opposition Afghan forces under the banner of the Northern Alliance did the groundwork. Alliance fighters, notorious in the past for their human rights abuses, became Washington's friends and overnight champions of democracy as they fought against the Taliban with new momentum. And backed by the world's most powerful air force, they soon had the Taliban on the run. The first nail in the Taliban coffin was the fall of the key northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif in November. This was followed by a massacre at a fortress outside the city when alliance fighters backed by US warplanes and special forces came down hard on Taliban prisoners who staged an uprising. Among those killed were hundreds of Pakistani, Arab and Chechen Taliban volunteers.
Go, 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 go.
The next stunning gain for the alliance was the capital Kabul, which the Taliban deserted overnight without a fight. Alliance fighters swept into Kabul, ignoring calls from their American mentors to keep out because of concerns about the fate of the civilian population. The people of Kabul spilled out onto the streets to celebrate their newfound freedom after years under the repressive rule of the Taliban. The northern city of Kunduz was the next to fall, Taliban fighters deserting it in truckloads. The end of Taliban rule in Afghanistan came with the surrender of the militia's southern spiritual stronghold of Kandahar. But the US had to taste victory mixed with some bitterness when Mullah Omar disappeared amid the confusion. Against a backdrop of power struggles between various factions of the alliance, as well as among tribal chiefs, the UN managed to set up an interim government for Afghanistan under Hamid Karzai.
At least the war against terrorism and the Taliban has finished in the mainframe of things. But we'll have to look for their hideouts. We'll have to finish them completely in Afghanistan, and we are very serious about that. The same way that the Taliban did not represent Afghans, the same way that they did not represent Afghan values or history, exactly in the same way terrorism in no way represents anything in Islam.
The focus then shifted to the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, where bin Laden was believed to be hiding in a cave complex, along with hundreds of die-hard followers. The final chapter of the Afghan war saw intense bombing raids on the Tora Bora region, along with a ground offensive by Afghan militia to flush out al-Qaeda fighters. But when the last caves were overrun, there was no trace of bin Laden, only rumors that he may have fled across the border to Pakistan.
There has been information that has been gathered in Afghanistan that has directly resulted in the arrest of people across the world, in other side of the globe, and undoubtedly have prevented other terrorist activities. So it's a very worthwhile thing to be doing.
While the war in Afghanistan had far-reaching consequences worldwide, another major fallout of the September attacks felt across the globe was the economic one. A week after the attacks, Wall Street reopened amid fears that a paralyzed New York could drive the US economy into recession. Share prices plunged despite predictions of a patriotic rally, and the US Federal Reserve as well as the European Central Bank were forced to cut interest rates. With the insurance bill from the terror attacks estimated to reach a staggering $70 billion, airlines began cutting down their fleet sizes and sacking workers in their thousands. The US Congress approved a $15 billion bailout package for airline companies, but critics alleged that the only ones who benefited were the shareholders, while jobless workers were left high and dry. While the war was still raging in Afghanistan, the US came under the grip of an anthrax scare in October. It began with contaminated mail sent to a newspaper office in Florida and quickly spread across the country and then on to the rest of the world. At one stage, nearly 30 people tested positive for exposure to the deadly bacteria at the Washington office of Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. At least 5 people died, while more than a dozen were infected.
Anytime someone sends anthrax through the mail, in my judgment, it's a terrorist act. You don't send anthrax through the mail without the kind of intent and conduct that's, I think, fairly labeled as terrorism. And so we believe these to be terrorist acts. We are not able to rule out an association with the terrorist acts of September the 11th. But neither are we able to draw a conclusive link at this time in that respect.
The media whipped up a frenzy about bioterrorism by bin Laden's followers through the US Postal Service, but official investigations indicated that the source could be closer to home. The anthrax spores found in letters are believed to have been produced in the U.S. We'll be back after the break with a look back at the global political scene. Stay with us.
I always dream of you. My love. Samsung side-by-side refrigerator.
When bodies start to fail, auction for food, for power to burn. When it comes to bath time, it's fun time. Crack an empty egg and risk meeting your ends on Fankel House Special, Survivor Africa, tonight at 9 o'clock.
She can become emotionally affected by what she's experiencing, but it doesn't get in the way of her ability to be there, to be present in it.
When you shot your wife in the head, before you wrapped her in a blanket and you dumped her in the mouth.
Get your finger out of my face, bitch.
They are investigators of CSI, coming on January 7th. Heart-touching, mind-stretching, the message of hope and faith. Ramesh Richard New Year Special, Get Found. New Year's Day, Tuesday afternoon at 3:05.
Welcome back. On the political front, this year saw 2 Asian leaders fall from grace to be replaced by their more popular female deputies. Arch rivals India and Pakistan held an historic summit, which ended in failure because of the Kashmir problem. The controversial issue surfaced again when gunmen launched a daring suicide attack on the Indian Parliament. And a shooting rampage by a member of the royal family sent shockwaves across Nepal. But the world's focus remains on the troubled Middle East, amid the ongoing Palestinian uprising and Israel's clampdown on the Palestinians.
Violence in the Middle East continued unabated throughout the year as the Palestinian uprising took its toll on both Palestinians and Israelis. Hardliner Ariel Sharon of the Likud party won a landslide victory against Prime Minister Ehud Barak in February's elections. But victory for the man accused of triggering the uprising after a controversial visit to a shrine in Jerusalem in September last year did not end the violence. Israeli forces used their military might to clamp down on Palestinian territories and were accused of implementing a policy of assassinating Palestinian leaders. Radical Palestinian groups responded with suicide bombings. In December, a spate of suicide attacks rocked Israel in a 12-hour span. 16 people were killed in an explosion on board a bus in the northern port city of Haifa, while 2 blasts on a busy Jerusalem street just hours earlier claimed 12 lives and injured almost 200 people. Israel retaliated by launching strikes on Yasser Arafat's office in Gaza and threatened to oust the longtime Palestinian leader from power. Earlier in August, a blast ripped through a crowded pizza restaurant in Jerusalem, killing 15 people. And in an attack outside a Tel Aviv nightclub in June, 18 people were killed when a Palestinian suicide bomber blew himself up in a crowd of teenagers. Tension also rose after hardline Israeli tourism minister Rehavam Zaivi was assassinated in a Jerusalem hotel in October. The ongoing violence derailed a number of ceasefire agreements and dealt a setback to the peace initiatives proposed by the United States. Joseph Estrada was deposed following the second people power revolution in the Philippines in 15 years. Protests raged in January demanding the former actor's resignation for his involvement in a high-profile corruption scandal. Estrada, who had earlier been impeached by the Senate, began to lose support from his cabinet and the military. He was forced to resign from office later in the month, paving the way for his deputy, Gloria Arroyo, to assume the presidency.
The path that brought me here today has not been an easy one, and it is not yet an easy one. And I did not take that path alone. I came here riding on the wave created by millions of people making their voices heard above the dark confusion of crisis and confrontation. I have no grandiose dreams to become a great president, but I want to be a good president. Help me be a good president.
The disgraced former leader was taken into custody in April for alleged corruption and plundering. The move sparked further unrest in the country as Estrada's supporters took to the streets to denounce his arrest. Demonstrators clashed with the police as they tried to storm the presidential palace. This prompted Mrs. Arroyo to briefly declare a state of rebellion in the capital, Manila. The trial of the deposed leader opened later in the year. Estrada was accused of amassing $80 million in ill-gotten wealth during his tenure and faced a charge of plundering which carries the death penalty. Peace efforts in the country's south, meanwhile, received a boost when Mrs. Arroyo's government signed a landmark peace accord with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in October. And renegade governor Nur Miswari was arrested in Malaysia in the following month for inciting a rebellion on Hola Island in which dozens of people were killed. Another Asian leader who fell from grace was Indonesian President Abdurrahman Wahid. A showdown between the embattled leader and a hostile parliament reached a dramatic climax in July, following repeated threats by Mr. Wahid to dissolve parliament and declare a state of emergency. The People's Consultative Assembly voted to remove Mr. Wahid and installed his deputy, Megawati Sukarno Putri, as the country's fifth president. The political standoff ended when Mr. Wahid finally agreed to leave the presidential palace several days later. The new president had her hands full as she tried to revive the country's weak economy. But her fortunes received a boost when the fugitive son of former dictator Suharto was arrested in November. Tommy Suharto was implicated in the murder of a judge who had convicted him of corruption. In Thailand, Premier Thaksin Shinawatra retained power after he was acquitted of concealing assets during a previous government. A guilty verdict would have forced Mr. Thaksin to resign and plunged the country into political uncertainty. Tragedy struck Nepal's royal family on a fateful night in June. Crown Prince Dipendra was said to have gone on a shooting rampage, killing 9 members of his family, including his father, King Birendra, and his mother, Queen Aishwarya. The prince, who then turned the gun on himself, died days later after being crowned king. His uncle, Gayanendra, took over the throne. An official investigation found Dipendra responsible for the bloodbath. The tiny Himalayan kingdom was also plagued by an ongoing Maoist rebellion. Violence also hit neighbouring India when gunmen tried to storm Parliament in New Delhi in December. 14 people, including the 5 assailants, were killed. India blamed Pakistan-based separatist militants for the attack. The two long-time rivals had held a landmark summit earlier in the year in a bid to end half of a century of hostility. But the two sides failed to reach agreement on a number of thorny issues, including the future of Kashmir. In Japan, Yoshiro Mori stepped down as Prime Minister following a brief tenure marred by verbal gaffes and missteps. He was replaced by Liberal Democratic Party maverick Junichiro Koizumi, who enjoyed widespread popularity but has yet to offer a remedy for the country's economic woes. In Australia, John Howard won a 3rd term of office after holding off a challenge from the opposition Labour Party. The Premier had made his conservative anti-immigration stance the centrepiece of a controversial campaign. East Timor held its first democratic elections before gaining full nationhood next year, with independence leader Xanana Gusmao widely tipped to become its first president.
East Timor has once again defied and proven wrong those skeptics who doubted its political maturity and the eloquence of its democratic feelings.
Fijians also went to the polls to elect a new government, following last year's long-running hostage crisis. Indigenous caretaker Prime Minister Laisenia Korase was sworn in as Premier, while the deposed Mahendra Chowdhury agreed to join a new administration. Former Yugoslav strongman Slobodan Milosevic was extradited to the United Nations War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague in June, where he was accused of committing crimes against humanity during the Kosovo conflict 2 years ago. But the ousted leader refused representation and challenged the legality of the hearing, saying the court was a propaganda tool of the United States and its allies. Milosevic was formally indicted for genocide later in the year.
Wish to enter your please.
The Northern Ireland peace efforts received a major boost when the Irish Republican Army began a landmark move to disarm in October. Ulster Unionist leader David Trimble was re-elected the first Prime Minister of the province after he had resigned earlier in the year. Tony Blair was returned to power in Britain thanks to his second landslide poll victory. The Prime Minister easily defeated William Hague and the Conservative Party in the general election in June. Relations between the United States and Russia suffered after Washington decided to unilaterally abandon the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty and pursue the controversial Missile Defense Shield. A series of meetings between Presidents George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin, including their first summit in Slovenia in June, failed to resolve their differences. Washington also came under fire from the international community after it became the only major country that failed to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. The accord, which was signed by 178 nations following marathon talks in the German city of Bonn in July, was aimed at combating global warming and reducing the emission of greenhouse gases. Latin America's most wanted man was captured in Venezuela in June. Vladimiro Montesinos, the spy chief under disgraced former Peruvian president Alberto Fujimori, was flown home to face trial for murder, corruption and embezzlement. And anti-globalization protesters were determined to make their voices be heard despite clampdown by the authorities. The rallies during the G8 summit in Genoa in July turned deadly after a demonstrator was killed by Italian authorities amid allegations of police brutality. Earlier in April, tens of thousands of demonstrators made their presence felt at the Summit of the Americas in the Canadian city of Quebec, where leaders pledged to open up their markets in 4 years' time. And the end of the year saw Argentina in turmoil as people took to the streets to protest against the government's austerity measures. Days of looting and rioting across the country left 28 people dead and forced President Fernando de la Rúa to step down. Provincial Governor Adolfo Rodriguez Sá was sworn in as the interim president until new elections are to be held in March. He faces a massive task in bringing Argentina out of its economic crisis.
After the break, we'll take a look at what this year had in store for China. We'll also have a look back at disasters that shook the globe, and on a more pleasant note, the world of sports. Stay with us.
Lange und Söhne time check is now 21 minutes to 9. Local time check was brought to you by Lange und Söhne.
Track the high road to Shangri-La for the paradise on earth. Set sail on an extraordinary homemade raft for a Mississippi wild ride. Come experience a little bit of Havana behind the lens on assignment Cuba. National Geographic, tonight at 10 o'clock.
Children by nature are inquisitive. Every child is unique. But all children deserve our concerted efforts to help them climb higher and see further.
Behind the facade of glitz and glamour, a shadowy world lurks, where lonely, dispossessed souls roam and evil spirits refuse to rest. Be prepared to be afraid. Haunted London, Sunday at 9 o'clock.
個職位高，壓力大；收入高，應酬多；血脂高，危險啊！膽固醇升高，甘油三自升高，漢林牌青脂膠囊每天清一清，血脂不再高。漢林牌青脂膠囊。
Welcome back. China ended a 15-year quest to join the World Trade Organization after its membership was approved in November. Cross-trade commercial ties are also expected to improve following Taiwan's accession to the WTO and the resumption of the so-called mini-three links. But Sino-American ties were dealt a severe blow because of a diplomatic row between Beijing and Washington over the spy plane incident.
The spy plane row dealt the first severe blow to Sino-U.S. ties under the presidency of George W. Bush. An American EP-3 aircraft collided with a Chinese fighter jet in the South China Sea on the 1st of April and was forced to make an emergency landing at Lingshui Air Base on Hainan Island. A war of words erupted over who was responsible, as both sides accused each other of causing the collision. Mr. Bush and other senior U.S. leaders fell short of offering a full apology as demanded by Beijing, although he expressed regret for the incident, which claimed the life of the Chinese pilot. The body of Wang Wei was never recovered, as he was honored by Beijing's leadership and declared a revolutionary martyr. A team of U.S. diplomats arrived in Hainan to begin negotiations in a bid to win the release of the 24 crew members of the spy plane. They were detained for 10 days before being freed and returned to the U.S. Another diplomatic tug-of-war centered on China's insistence that the crippled aircraft could not be flown out of Hainan. The row also did not prevent the Pentagon from resuming its surveillance flights off the Chinese coast. But after holding tough negotiations, the two sides finally agreed that the plane was to be dismantled. It was sent back to the U.S. on board a Russian cargo plane in July. But the controversy continued after China expressed dissatisfaction, saying the payment offered by the U.S. for the incident was inadequate. Ties between Beijing and Washington also suffered following the detention of several Chinese-American academics on the mainland. Among them were Li Xiaomin of Hong Kong City University and American University scholar Gao Zhan. Professor Li, who was convicted of spying by a mainland court, later returned to Hong Kong to resume his teaching duties. Ms. Gao was arrested during a family visit to the mainland in February. Her husband and son were released after 26 days, while Ms. Gao was also convicted of spying and sentenced to a 10-year term by a mainland court in July, before being granted medical parole and allowed to return to the U.S. But Sino-U.S. ties received a boost when Mr. Bush held his first summit with President Jiang Zemin in October on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Shanghai. Asia-Pacific leaders pledged to strengthen regional economic cooperation and combat terrorism. Several high-profile bomb attacks hit the mainland this year. A series of blasts wrecked 4 workers' dormitories in Shijiazhuang in Hebei province in March and claimed 108 lives. 4 people were given life sentences in connection with the attacks. In December, 24 explosions rocked 2 Guangdong cities within a 48-hour span, killing 6 people. And 2 people, including the suicide bomber, were killed, and dozens of people were injured in an attack on an American fast food outlet in Xi'an. China took a giant step towards becoming a key global economic power following its accession to the World Trade Organization. Beijing's membership was formally approved during the WTO ministerial meeting in the Qatari capital Doha in November, ending a 15-year quest. But the move sparked fears of massive job losses for mainland workers, especially in the farming sector. Taiwan's accession to the WTO was approved 1 day after China's entry. Delegates at the meeting also sealed a deal to launch a new round of global trade talks. Cross-strait ties received a boost following the implementation of the so-called mini-three links. Kinmen County Magistrate Chen Shui-Tsai led a delegation in a landmark visit to the port city of Xiamen in January, on board the first Taiwanese vessels in more than half a century to travel directly to the mainland. But the two sides have yet to reach agreements on direct trade, shipping, and postal links. And there were signs that cross-strait commercial ties would improve further when a top advisory body to the island's leader, Chen Shui-Bian, recommended in August that Taipei relax the so-called patience over haste policy and ease investment curbs of Taiwanese firms on the mainland. There were fears of political uncertainty on the island after the once powerful Kuomintang lost its majority in the legislature for the first time ever. The KMT lost a third of its parliamentary seats during elections held in December, while Mr. Chen's ruling Democratic Progressive Party became the largest party in the 225-strong legislative yuan. But both Beijing and the DPP played down fears that cross-strait ties would suffer, despite the party's pro-independence stance.
There were more tears this year as a result of natural and man-made disasters. One of the worst affected countries was India, where thousands died in a killer earthquake. Also among the most devastating events was the crash of an American Airlines passenger jet in the United States.
In November, an American Airlines passenger jet crashed into the New York borough of Queens minutes after takeoff, killing 265 people, including 5 on the ground. The crash of Flight 587, bound for the Dominican Republic, initially sparked fears of another terror attack on the United States, prompting authorities to switch to a defensive mode, closing access routes into Manhattan and sending out fighter jets to patrol the skies. Investigators are focusing on whether turbulence from the wake of a jumbo jet or a possible flaw in the tail fin design caused the Airbus A300 to break apart. A stray Ukrainian missile fired during naval exercises in October accidentally downed a Siberian airliner over the Black Sea, killing all 78 people on board. The doomed jet was en route to Novosibirsk from Tel Aviv. Russian President Vladimir Putin initially raised the specter of suspected terrorist involvement in the mid-air explosion. In the same month, an overloaded boat smuggling asylum seekers, mainly from the Middle East and Afghanistan, into Australia, sank off Indonesia. More than 350 people drowned in the tragedy. Indonesia's police chief denied media reports of illegal immigrants being forced by officers at gunpoint onto the unseaworthy vessel. Meanwhile, critics slammed Canberra's hardline policy of barring boat people as a ploy to help clinch the general election. This year's typhoons left a trail of death and destruction in Southeast Asia. Tropical storm Ling Ling wreaked havoc in November, with the death toll climbing to about 260 in the southern Philippines alone. In other hard-hit areas, floods triggered by Typhoon Nari claimed at least 84 lives in the Taiwan capital in September. The island was still reeling from the effects of July's Typhoon Taraji, which caused at least 100 fatalities. Japan suffered one of its worst post-war fires in September, when 44 people died from carbon monoxide poisoning during a karaoke bar inferno in Tokyo's Shinjuku red light district. Failure to provide sufficient escape routes trapped revelers inside the smoke-filled bar. A gas leak may have started the blaze, but investigators have yet to rule out arson. In August, safety measures in the Philippines came under the spotlight when a blaze broke out in a karaoke bar in a budget hotel in Manila, killing at least 74 members attending a religious conference. The Manor Hotel became a death trap for many of the victims, who died of smoke inhalation. An amateur video captured the moment in May when a dance floor collapsed during a wedding in Jerusalem, killing at least 24 guests and injuring more than 300. In April, 43 people were trampled to death in a soccer stampede in South Africa when thousands of fans stormed Johannesburg's already packed Ellis Park Stadium. The sports minister dismissed fears the disaster, which was blamed on a lack of crowd control, would affect the nation's bid to host the World Cup in 9 years' time. A United States submarine sank a Japanese fishing trawler as it practiced an emergency surfacing maneuver near Hawaii in February, killing 9 people on board the Emi Maru, including 4 students. The collision strained Japanese-US ties and challenged the practice of inviting civilians aboard submarines. In January, India suffered its most devastating earthquake in half a century. The disaster in the western state of Gujarat claimed tens of thousands of lives and brought misery to the hundreds of thousands left homeless amid fears of an outbreak of epidemics. The ghosts of 2 major disasters last year were laid to rest when a funeral was held in St. Petersburg for 11 sailors recovered from a wrecked Russian nuclear submarine 15 months after the Kursk plunged to the bottom of the Barents Sea. All 118 crew were killed following mysterious onboard explosions. And the Concorde made a roaring comeback in November, following the grounding of flights from London and Paris to New York over safety fears in the wake of last July's fatal crash outside Paris, which claimed 113 lives.
There were defining moments in the world of sports as well, especially for China. Beijing painted the town red over the past 12 months, winning the right to host the Olympics in 2008 and securing a berth in the World Cup finals for the first time ever.
The games of the 29 Olympiad in 2008 are awarded to the city of Beijing.
Beijing won the ultimate sporting prize of the year. The capital was chosen to host the Olympic Games in 7 years' time, beating off strong competition from Paris, Toronto and Osaka. The triumph made amends for missing out on the chance to stage the 2000 Games and sent the city into an Olympic frenzy. The excitement was only matched by China's first qualification for a Soccer World Cup. A 1-0 victory over Oman was enough to end years of disappointment and book China a ticket to Japan and South Korea next summer. China are grouped with Brazil, Costa Rica and Turkey in the preliminary stage. Tennis provided the underdog story of the year. Goran Ivanisevic contested Wimbledon as a wild-card entry, and the outcome was exactly that, wild. The colourful Croatian gained a reputation for bearing his chest as he swept aside the pre-tournament favourites. Pat Rafter appeared to have tamed Ivanisevic, only to see the 29-year-old win the decisive fifth set for a 6-3, 3-6, 6-3, 2-6, 9-7 win in the final to become the first ever wildcard ever to win a Grand Slam. The women's final was much more predictable. The powerful Venus Williams proved too much to handle for Belgian teenager Justin Henin. Henin had no answer to the American, who won 6-1, 3-6, 6-love. Lance Armstrong made it 3 wins in a row in the Tour de France. 5 years after being diagnosed with advanced testicular cancer, the American coasted to victory along the Champs-Élysées. He became only the 5th person to win 3 or more Tour de France. Michael Schumacher was equally formidable on 4 wheels. The German Formula One ace clinched the title with a record equaling 9 wins, and he helped Ferrari to another Constructors' Championship win in the process. Takumo Sato joined Schumacher as a Macau Formula 3 Grand Prix winner. Sato became the first Japanese driver to win the Macau Grand Prix. The 24-year-old beat Frenchman Benoit Trullier to the line. Marion Jones played the role of leading lady at the Athletics World Championships in Canada. However, the American failed in her quest for a sweep of the sprinting titles after suffering a shock defeat to Ukraine's Zana Pinchuzevich-Bloch in the 100 metres. Jones gained revenge in the 200 metres. However, the meet in Edmonton was also mired in a series of drug scandals, the most embarrassing of which involved Olga Yegorova. The Russian runner was cleared to compete at the championships despite failing a drugs test. The result, Yegorova won the 5,000 metres title, but was booed all the way to the finish line. In the United States, the Arizona Diamondbacks claimed a remarkable win in baseball's World Series. Their rivals, the New York Yankees, staged 2 dramatic fightbacks to send the series to a decisive Game 7, where the D-backs shattered the record books with a 15-2 win. Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant led the Los Angeles Lakers to their 2nd straight NBA championship. The Lakers scored a comprehensive 4-1 win over the Philadelphia 76ers in the best-of-7 final. The 76ers' Allen Iverson did have something to celebrate, as he was named the NBA's most valuable player. Top golfer Tiger Woods made his first trip to China for an exhibition event at Mission Hills in Shenzhen. Although he failed to win the event, finishing level with playing partners Zhang Langwei and Ye Weizhe, Tiger wowed the galleries and launched the First Tee Foundation to promote the sport in China. And Japanese horses scored a sweep of the major titles at the International Race Day in Hong Kong. Agnes Digital, Ensign Preston and Stay Gold all carried the Japanese flag to victory at Sha Tin.
And that brings us to the end of our special program focusing on the events that shaped the year. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.
From the ailing economy to the re-election bid of the